Looking back on the things from the past that filled you with joy, that's a wonderful feeling. A little bit of nostalgia never hurts. Going back to a favorite movie, TV show, book, video game, or what have you can definitely put you in a better mood when things are not going well for you. However, nostalgia tends to be a key selling point for a lot of products nowadays. Whether they're rehashing long lost toys, whether they're remaking something that doesn't need a remake, or whether they just want to shove in as much 80s nostalgia as they possibly can. Marketing the past has quite a bit of value from the perspective of marketing teams. However, oftentimes they get the nostalgia wrong. This falls in the category of having characters just spout off names of things from a specific time period. For example, having a character in the 80s go, "Guys, I'd totally love to go running with you now that I have my new LA Gear high tops, but unfortunately, tonight I'm going to watch Alf and then Dynasty while drinking Bartles and James." No one in the 80s talked like that. And while yes, all those are products of the 80s, no one ever talked like that. It's stupid, and it's pandering, and it's horrible writing. But the thing is, what they're trying to do is what South Park lovingly called member berries. The idea of just shoving things in your face to make you go, "Oh, I know what that is. I like that. That's from my childhood. That's from the old times. My dad told me about that stuff." But guess what? That doesn't turn into profits. In fact, that can turn off a lot of viewers because they look at it as a form of pandering. Member berries are just pandering. And while you might get tricked once or twice into diving into a member berry pie, most of the time you'll look at it and go, "Oh, come on, seriously?" But there are those of you out there who can't let go, and that's fine. There's plenty of things from my childhood that I still love. Everyone feels that way. But remember, don't buy into the marketing hype. Just because it's from the 80s or the 90s or features a logo or name you remember, it doesn't mean that product is going to be good. Oftentimes, it seems like those products are relatively shoddy. However, every once in a while, we get a good example of how to utilize nostalgia properly. Today's movie is an example of doing 90s nostalgia right. Today, we're looking at Fear Street, Part 1, 1994, and unlike most nostalgia-driven movies, it's not going to suck. Can I stop reviewing stuff on Netflix, please? The last few things have all been from Netflix, and now I'm going to be doing 3 movies in a row from Netflix. It's almost as if that's my primary way of receiving entertainment nowadays. Whatever, let's get on with the review. The movie opens with a scene set in a mall, very fitting for a 90s movie. It's a cold open wherein a psycho killer wearing a skull mask ends up murdering a woman and then being stopped by the police. It helps sets the tone for the world in which you're going to be experiencing during the course of this movie. Shadyside is not a safe place. It is a place where psychopaths murder people. A lot. And this helps set the tone for just another psycho with a knife. After that, we get an opening sequence that is reminiscent of American Horror Story, but fills in little news clippings and things like that help tell you a little bit about the history of Shadyside. It's a nice way of teasing you about things that will be explained further on in the movie, and I'm sure the other 2 movies will have their own versions of this opening sequence. Our real story begins by introducing our cast of characters at school. Nothing's more scary than school. We end up meeting Josh and Dina, who are siblings. In addition to that, we also meet Kate and Simon, and they're just going about their normal day, talking about the psycho killer, making some jokes, bringing up the witch that cursed the town, little things like that. While they make jokes and don't really take any of the history of Shadyside seriously, the group is forced to go to the memorial for the victims that were killed by the knife-wielding maniac. Dina uses that opportunity to give back her ex's stuff. Of course, tensions build up between the Shady Side and Sunnyvale kids, leading to some shenanigans on the road, and unfortunately this leads to a car crash where Sam, Dina's ex, ends up accidentally invoking the wrath of the witch. Our characters are then stalked by various killers, but the movie does something fun with this, where it makes you wonder if they are actually real killers or Sunnyvale kids playing a prank. Of course, this is a slasher, so they turn out to be real killers. This leads our group on a chase running through houses, hospitals, and even a police station, because we need to have all the horror tropes. They take an interesting route to solve the mystery of the psycho killers, and in the end, of course, we get our sequel bait, which we already knew there was going to be a sequel, so it's not that huge of a surprise. But overall, the story is pretty good. It has some twists and turns and some gory deaths. You don't need much more from a simple slasher movie. What sets this apart from your average modern slasher is the characters. They're very likable. Dina, she ends up getting involved with this whole thing due to her issues with her ex, Sam, and her feelings towards Sunnyvale and the preppy kids that go to that school. Her brother, Josh, also gets involved due to his obsession with the psycho killers and the history of Shadyside. This makes him a very important character to the story, primarily because he fills in the exposition that's necessary to let the audience know who these killers are, what they're after, and how to stop the witch's curse. The only issue I had with Dina and Josh is that they're supposed to be siblings, but they look nothing alike. Now, granted, I lived in a blended family, so that happens, but there's never really a talk about anything like that. It just seems like if you wanted them to be blood related, you might want to make the two actors look at least a little bit alike, but I can probably just accept them as a blended family. Minor gripe, but figured I'd bring it up now. We then have the two major supporting characters to our siblings, which is Kate. She's a strange mix of overachiever and drug dealer. She ends up being kind of more of the voice of reason of the group, obviously not being super drawn into any of the weird mystical stuff, but seeing some of the strange killers and weird things going on, she finds herself drawn into this whole mess and tries to be the one to push the characters towards escaping rather than trying to fight back. And then there's Simon. Simon is kind of your stereotypical slasher movie stoner dude who seems kind of like a dummy, but still can, be helpful to the team every once in a while. What makes his character work is that he's very likable and fun as the comedy relief. He does not come off as obnoxious, and instead really works in a lot of the scenes, especially with some of his crazy ideas and weird ways that he behaves. Finally, we have Sam. Sam is Dina's ex-girlfriend, and she is trying to escape the insanity that is Shadyside by living with her divorced mom in Sunnyvale and trying to just be normal. She finds herself, of course, caught up in the witch's curse, making her one of the major focal points of this movie. And in the end, you kind of see her grow from someone who seems like she's very shallow into having quite a bit of depth and being a really likable character you want to see survive. Overall, our 5 leads are generally likable characters played by very decent actors who feel like legitimate teenage characters. Oftentimes that's a problem with a lot of slasher movies where the teenage characters do not act or look like teenagers, and this time around we got that. Now, no horror movie is complete without the proper aesthetics. And for music, we have an amazing soundtrack made up of some rocking 90s hits. It's great. I actually would love to have the soundtrack. It's essentially a best of an entire decade. While I am fairly certain some of the songs came out well after 1994, oftentimes the characters are listening to these songs, but you can kind of let these kinds of things pass if the story itself and the characters are likable enough. And they didn't do anything that really felt out of place. And more importantly, they didn't just name drop a bunch of bands they liked. They had the music in the background as they were going through their daily lives. As teenagers, especially in the 90s, would probably be blasting their music, listening to their Walkman or their Discman, depending on what part of the 90s you're in. And this felt very, very much in tone and feel with kind of the bleakness of this movie. There is standard background music as well. It feels like typical horror music. There's really not much I can say about it. And it gets massively overshadowed by the 90s songs. As for the special effects, we do get quite a bit of CG, and I'm not the biggest CG fan when it comes to horror movies. I do prefer practical effects. However, they did a good job with a lot of the death scenes, even though CG was used quite a bit, sometimes more comically than others. However, it did look like there were some makeup and practical effects being used here and there. While I should harp on the CG not being that good, I would point out that this felt like a lower budget production, and I'm willing to forgive mediocre CG if the production is a smaller production. Not only that, but everything looked natural enough to work within the world of the movie. The one thing I will say is that they did use their R rating. You have a lot of swearing, a lot of violence, and even a sex scene, or, well, heavy petting scene. It provides a nostalgic look back at the 90s without being, hey dude, I'm rocking out to this new Nirvana album while drinking a Zima and pumping up my shoes. Woo! No one acts like that. They act like regular people going on with their regular lives who happen to have normal teenage stuff going on. Are there some posters and some music that's referential? Does the clothing referential? Sure. But they don't rub it in your face as, hey, 90s, remember 90s? 90s. They don't do that. Thank you. It's not that hard to make a nostalgic movie without doing the stupid pandering and member berries. I will admit one major thing. I never read the Fear Street books. Without trying to sound like I'm bragging, I was reading adult level books at the age of 11. So right when I would have been the proper time to really enjoy these books, I was reading Michael Crichton and Stephen King. So yeah, that. I did watch this with someone who did read some of the books, and it seems like they kept a lot of the tone and feel without actually adapting any specific story. Frankly, I think that's the better way to go, because if you adapted a story, there'd be a lot of comparisons to that original story, versus adapting the world itself and making Shadyside its own fleshed out world. Wherein, maybe after this trilogy, they could do an anthology series or another set of movies that maybe are adapted from the books. But whether or not they do that, this trilogy itself will hopefully remain at the same level of quality as this first movie. There are some aspects of this movie that look low budget, but like any good slasher movie, you can forgive that if you have likable characters and cool death scenes. And this has likable characters and pretty decent death scenes overall. You even have a few fun extra tropes in there, like no one's parents are around, and the police are completely useless. And honestly, seeing those old tropes just makes me smile for some reason. It's stupid, it makes no sense, but for some reason I can buy it within the world of Fear Street. If you're looking for a fun, rated R slasher movie, and you want something that feels like it's right out of the early 90s, this would be the way to go. Likeable characters, good deaths, a little bit of low budget issues of the CG, and some of the music comes post 1994, but those minor gripes aside, this was an enjoyable experience and makes me excited to see the next movie, which will hopefully be a fun take on a sleepaway camp, Friday the 13th, camp killer knockoff type movie. Thank you for watching. Please let me know in the comments what you think about the first Fear Street movie. And until next time, please like and subscribe, and check out our description for ways to support the channel. I'll be back with Fear Street Part 2. Until then, I'll see you at the tavern.